Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into the world of feminist philosophy to see how two traditions that seem totally opposed actually end up climbing the exact same mountains, asking the same urgent questions about identity, power, and justice. Okay, so let's set the stage. In philosophy, you've got these two major schools of thought that are often miles apart. On one side, you've got the Analytic tradition. Think of them as the architects, obsessed with logical blueprints, crystal clear definitions, and just really precise arguments. And on the other side, you have the Continental tradition. They're more like historians, digging through all the messy layers of power and culture to figure out how our world actually got built. So yeah, they approach things so differently. You'd think they would never see eye to eye. But what happens when these two, the architect and the historian, decide to tackle one of the most critical projects of our time, feminism? Well, it turns out they both find themselves wrestling with the same three monumental questions. First, there's the identity question. What does it even mean to be a woman? Second, the freedom question. How do you actually fight back against oppression? And finally, the knowledge question. Whose voice gets to be heard and whose gets silenced? So let's start with that first question, because it's really the one that kicked off this whole modern conversation. And it all began with a single, absolutely revolutionary idea. This famous line from Simone de Beauvoir, all the way back in 1949, just blew the doors wide open. She was the one who drew that sharp line between biological sex and socially learned gender. It was a total game changer. But, it also created a whole new set of really tough problems that philosophers are still trying to solve today. And this is where the Analytic tradition, the architects, really went to work breaking it all down with surgical precision. A thinker named Sally Haslinger identified two core issues here. First, what she called the commonality problem. I mean, think about it. Is there any single experience that unites all women, from a refugee to a queen? It's tough, right? And then there's the normativity problem, which asks, when we talk about women, are we maybe just secretly using the experiences of privileged Western women as the default for everyone? So Haslinger's solution was to propose what she calls an ameliorative concept. She basically said, hey, let's forget about shared feelings or experiences for a second and focus on social position. In her view, a woman is someone who is systematically put in a subordinate position because of bodily features that are linked to reproduction. It's a definition built not on some fuzzy sense of identity, but on the cold, hard reality of oppression. Now, the Continental tradition, especially through the philosopher Judith Butler, comes at this from a totally different angle. For them, gender isn't something you are, it's something you do. Butler says we're all constantly performing our gender based on these unwritten social scripts. And get this, over time, these performances are so powerful that they actually construct what we think of as natural, biological sex itself. And this leads to an even deeper, more mind-bending challenge, one that thinkers like Luce Irigaray pointed out. If woman is only ever defined as the other to man, who is seen as the one, the default human, then woman doesn't really have an independent meaning at all. In a language system built by and for men, a true woman can't even be fully conceived of. Look, I know this can feel really abstract, but this is not just some philosophical word game. How we answer this question, who is a woman, has massive real-world consequences. It directly shapes everything from how we write anti-discrimination laws to how we build inclusive social movements. The stakes here are incredibly high. And that leads us straight into our second big question. If gender is this deeply baked into our society and even our language, how on earth do we get free? How do we fight back? Judith Butler's answer is a concept called resignification. The basic idea is that you can't just step outside of power. It's everywhere. But what you can do is disrupt it from the inside. You can take the very terms, the norms, the categories that were meant to control you, and you can use them in subversive, unexpected ways. It's kind of like hacking the system from within. But, not everyone in the Continental camp was totally sold on this. The philosopher Nancy Fraser argued that focusing only on cultural subversion just wasn't enough. She proposed a three-pronged attack. She said to get real justice, you have to fight on 3 fronts at once: culture, economics, and politics, all at the same time. Meanwhile, over in the analytic camp, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum offered a much more concrete, down-to-earth framework. Her capabilities approach is basically a checklist for justice. She says, look, a just society isn't about some abstract idea of freedom. It's about making sure every single person has the real-world capabilities to live a full life. Things like good health, safety from violence, and self-respect. So you see, even though their toolkits are completely different, both traditions keep circling back to the same fundamental paradox. If your very identity as a woman is constructed by the same systems of power you're trying to fight, how can you ever be a truly independent agent of your own liberation? It's a real puzzle. And that brings us to our final question: the fight to simply be heard. This is where all those abstract ideas about power hit the very real, very painful experience of speaking up and not being believed. At its heart, the problem is simple, and it's devastating. What happens when your knowledge, your testimony, your whole experience of the world is just dismissed, simply because of who you are? The analytic tradition actually gave this a name: testimonial injustice. Miranda Fricker defined this as what happens when someone's credibility is unfairly shot down because of a prejudice against their identity. The classic example: a woman raising a perfectly rational concern only to be told she's just being too emotional. But Fricker pointed out there's a second, even deeper kind of injustice. She called it hermeneutical injustice. This happens when an entire group lacks the very words to make sense of their own experience. Think about it. Before the term sexual harassment was invented, women were suffering from something they literally couldn't name. It was an injustice rooted in a gap in our shared language. The Continental tradition, of course, zooms out even further. Following thinkers like Foucault, they see these things not as just personal biases or isolated incidents. No, they see them as features of a much bigger system, what they call power/knowledge regimes that control what even counts as knowledge, and most importantly, who gets to be considered a knower in the first place. So after climbing these 3 massive mountains, identity, freedom, and knowledge, from 2 completely different paths, what's the big takeaway? Where do we go from here? Well, at the end of the day, the point isn't about which side won or which tradition has all the right answers. It's that we need both of these toolkits, the architects and the historians, for the same shared project: to understand and ultimately to dismantle oppression. This ongoing conversation, this tension between the two, is exactly what keeps feminist thought sharp, relevant, and moving forward. And as the lines between these traditions continue to blur, it leaves us with one last thought. A provocative question, really. If the old debates are evolving, what new mountains are on the horizon? What will be the next urgent questions that the next generation of feminist thinkers has to answer?